Now, immediately after this text of divorce, because marriage is connected with children, this is one possible reason why Mark brings this section of Jesus and children here. People were bringing little children to him. So now the fact that Mark mentioned little children, he's referring very specifically to those chronologically young. So maybe children in arms, for example, maybe toddlers, for example, those who have just learned to walk, for example. This is who Mark possibly means. Now, because at the time of Jesus, children ought to be not only not heard, but not even seen, the disciples spoke sternly. You might remember that the same verb was used, rebuke, epitimao, was used by Simon Peter when he spoke sternly to Jesus after the first passion and resurrection prediction. Epitimao is also a verb used when Jesus exorcises demons. The reason for the translation spoke sternly here is the context, but the same verb is used by Mark. So it is as if the disciples are telling the people that they have demons for even imagining that they can bring little children to Jesus. He's such an important rabbi. He's such a well-known rabbi. How can you even think that you can bring children to him? This is basically what Mark is indicating here. They spoke sternly. Jesus, however, was upset, and Mark uses again a strong verb here, indignant. In other words, Mark is saying that the Jesus of his gospel is very clear that the child teaches a lesson just by being a child. So the child is able. Now, earlier on, you might remember in the second passion and resurrection prediction, when Jesus gave them a lesson on discipleship, he mentioned the child. The disciples have forgotten that lesson completely. Because for them still, the idea that the kingdom comes as small as a mustard seed is unthinkable. They cannot simply accept it. And so Jesus has to be strong. If you cannot acknowledge your dependence, if you think that you are independent, then not only will you not enter the kingdom, but you cannot enter the kingdom. Because of your independence, you do not allow yourself. So it is not all the case where God pushes away people. No, it's people who go back or who hold themselves back and will not take the step forward by showing their dependence on God. Taking the children up in his arms is an indication that they would have been young children, possibly toddlers, possibly just learning to walk. And here, it is a public demonstration. So Jesus will not only lay his hands on them and bless them, but he will also take them up in his arms. So the child, basically both chronologically and a child in spirit, is what Jesus is talking about. Jesus continues to give a lesson on the kind of person who will follow him in the scene of the rich man. Now, many call this the scene of the rich young man, but we notice, except for Matthew, who calls him the rich young man, Luke calls him a ruler, and in Mark, he's certainly not young because he has kept all the commandments that Jesus talks about since his youth. So he cannot be young. However, this man, rich man, very clearly the point is he is rich. And Jesus is setting out on a journey, possibly, Mark means, not simply a journey, but moving toward Jerusalem. And the setting out on a journey is also to indicate that Jesus is on the road. The man kneels before him in an indication that the man is serious, that the man wants to know, and that his question is a question which stems from his heart. He does not want to test Jesus like the earlier Pharisees wanted to do. He addresses Jesus as good teacher. Matthew changes this in his gospel when he says, teacher, what good deed? Because when Jesus says, why do you call me good? Matthew cannot accept that. Why do you call me good? Of course, Jesus is good. So Matthew changes to say, teacher, what good deed? Matthew will say, then Matthew's next will be, why do you ask me about what is good? Mark, however, has got no problems with Jesus accepting that only God is good. He also is moving towards that goodness. This is the Markan Jesus who is so strongly human. The only time the word good is used of a person, agathos. Basically, agathos is the person who is good. The meaning of the name agathos is good. The man wants to know about zoe ainos, that is eternal life. And Jesus talks once again, the focus must always be God. The commandments that Jesus quotes are commandments not so much which have to do with God, but which have to do with neighbor. That is the relationships, how one deals with people in this life. Because very clearly, later on, when Jesus is asked about the first commandment, Jesus will include Leviticus 19:18, which speaks of love of neighbor. So if one loves neighbor, one loves God. Here, Jesus quotes these commandments. And all of these commandments have to do basically with how a person deals with his fellow men and women, how he deals with the members of his family, and so on. The man very clearly is a man who is following the law. And so it shows him as a seeker, shows him as a searcher. The man has done this. Now he wants to do even more. And because Jesus sees the seriousness of this man, and because Mark is unafraid to show us the emotions of Jesus, sees the man and loves him. But the love of Jesus manifests itself in issuing a command, issuing a challenge. And the man is invited. Notice, he is invited to change his lifestyle. The man is not merely invited to be generous with alms. The man is not merely invited to give half of his possessions to the poor. The man is not merely invited to share his wealth. The man is invited to give up his dependence. Because as long as he has wealth, he will continue to be dependent on it and not on God. And Jesus challenges him because the man is serious and Jesus wants to help him. And Jesus gives him the answer to the way in which he can help himself. If you continue to be dependent on external treasure, if you continue to be dependent on what is outside of you, then you cannot be dependent on God. And that's why the call is for a total renunciation. The man, we are told, Mark uses a very, very strong verb, stugnazo. The man was shocked. He could not believe his ears. Are you mad? Literally, the word shocked should be translated as the man is asking Jesus, are you mad? I'm asking you about eternal life and you're telling me I must give up. Are you mad? This is the way shocked must be interpreted. Stugnazo. It also denotes anger. I mean, how are you a rabbi? Can you call yourself a rabbi? That kind of anger. And he went away grieving because he thought that Jesus would answer him, but he never got his answer. That's why he grieves. But then Mark will add why the grieving actually is because he had many possessions, and my translation of that verse is not so much that he had many possessions, but that his many possessions had him. His many possessions controlled him. His many possessions owned him. His many possessions possessed him. And because the man goes away grieving, and because people would have wondered why he went away, and also because people would not have understood what Jesus is inviting the man to do, Jesus has to explain. It is hard for those who have wealth, no, not so much for those who have wealth, but for those whom wealth has. And because the disciples understand it, those who have wealth, now wealth is considered as a sign of God's favor. Wealth is considered as a sign of God's blessings. Wealth is considered as a sign that God is pleased with a person. That is how rich people regard their wealth. God is good to me. God is lovely to me. God is caring of me. That's why I am so rich. However, the perplexion of the disciples makes Jesus very clearly call them paidion, children, paidia, children. How hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. And then it is easier for a camel, camelon, not camelon, which is rope or cable, but camelon. There are some, because the word camelon refers to camel and camelon refers to rope, they think Jesus was talking about a rope. No, Jesus is talking about the largest known animal in Palestine, the camel. And he's talking about the smallest known opening, not the gate. Some people think it was the gate, so the camel had to bend low to enter the gate to come into Jerusalem. No, he's talking about literally the eye of a needle. I remember when I was a small child, my mother would tell me to threadle the needle because she considered my eyesight and the eyesight of my brothers and sisters as better than hers. And we would look at that needle, we would hold it in our hand like this and look at the thread. We would put the thread in our mouth like this to make it nice and hard, and we tried to push it in. And after effort, we would be able to manage to threadle the needle to give her to stitch. This is exactly what Jesus means when he says eye of the needle, and when he says camel, he refers to the animal, the camel, not the rope, camelon. And that's why they were astounded. They cannot believe. This is such a fantastic image that they cannot believe. Then it's impossible. Yes, that is the point. It is impossible. Nobody can be saved. However, it is impossible only if you depend on yourself. And it is impossible, not because it is impossible in itself, but because you make it impossible by not focusing on God, by making things God, by making possessions God, by looking at your possessions and your wealth as an end in itself. So while a person might keep the law, while a person might be good, what is also required is to acknowledge dependence on God. And the disciples, in the manner in which they have responded, and Peter being their spokesperson, immediately jump into the argument. Because Jesus has talked about giving up everything, and it is true, there is no doubt that Simon Peter and Andrew, James, and John have left everything. The point is now, what are we to have done? So Peter still is at the level of quid pro quo, at the level of barter exchange. Peter has not yet transformed his following into a following of love. It's a give and take as far as Peter is concerned. And Jesus very clearly responds that yes, there will be. And notice here, even though there is mention of Father who is given up, in the list which Jesus says of what one will gain, Father is missing, because God will be Father. And what is received, however, is with persecutions. So the first will be last, summarizes what Jesus has said in this teaching, when to say that really it is the last, those who count themselves as children, who will be the first in the kingdom. And so the section of the way, the second chapter, which begins in 9:31 with the second passion and resurrection prediction. This one, which is short, is misunderstood by all the disciples, because on the way they are discussing who is the greatest. The teaching of discipleship of Jesus here can be summarized in these two phrases, namely, the first must be last, and be childlike. This reinforcement is shown first by Jesus telling them that if there is somebody who is not against them, that person is surely for them, and inviting them not to be the cause of scandal, the cause of somebody else stumbling, somebody being disedified because of their behavior. Divorce and children go together, and so those two texts in chapter 10 are then dealt with, where Jesus asks those who question him to go to the origin, the reason for the creation, the unity and union of man and woman, rather than their separation. The rich man who approaches Jesus is unable to give up his riches because he is held by them, not because he has riches, but because riches have him. If the first passion and resurrection prediction was in one verse, the second was in one verse 8:31 and then 9:31, we notice that the third is the longest of all. Mark takes two whole verses, even after an introduction, to tell us about this passion and resurrection prediction. In an earlier lecture, I had said that it is only in Mark that all the three passion and resurrection predictions are on the way, and Mark specifies that here also. They were on the road or they were on the way. Now, clearly, they are coming close to the destination. That is, Mark tells us now the destination, which is Jerusalem. Jesus later in chapter 14, verse 28, and then the young man in chapter 16, verse 7, will say to his disciples, Jesus in 14:28, the young man in 16:7 will say, I am going ahead of you to Galilee. The young man will say, he's not here. He is gone ahead of you to Galilee, as he told you. Here, Jesus is walking ahead of them. This walking ahead of them is to indicate not only that Jesus leads the way, but also to indicate that Jesus will be the one who will first face the challenges before his disciples. So he's telling them that he will put his money where his mouth is. In other words, namely, that according to him, he will bear the brunt of them and set the example. He will edify rather than cause a scandal. The 12 are taken aside again, and private instruction is given. The Son of Man, once again, paradido nai, paradido me, the Son of Man will be handed over. So this handing over, and we come across the Son of Man saying, to whom will the Son of Man be handed over? Very clearly, the two groups are mentioned very clearly, the chief priests and the scribes. What will they do? They will condemn him at this trial before the Sanhedrin. Handing him over to the Gentiles is the trial before the Romans. So all of these trials are mentioned very clearly, almost as a summary, you might say, of the Passion narrative. Not only is that general summary given, even the specific thing which will happen: mocking, spitting, flogging, and killing. This is like a summary of what happens at the Roman trial, after the Roman trial in chapter 15, and after 3 days, he will rise again. Notice, once again and for the third time, Mark uses the active verb. He will rise again because of the faith Jesus has in God. Matthew will not show the disciples in as bad a light as Mark does. And so in Matthew, this scene is changed by Matthew when he says, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, and does not name them, because he possibly thinks people would have forgotten who they are. Mark, however, has no such qualms about it. He will name not only the sons, but also the father. So you don't forget, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, very clearly. They are the ones who come to him and they ask for a favor. And so very clearly it seems that they have not understood what Jesus is saying. And the fact that here they have come without Peter is an indication of even more subtlety in their coming. Usually, they were mentioned with Peter in the connection with the three, whom Jesus would take. Here, notice, they go on their own. And so very clearly, there is a hidden agenda as far as they are concerned. Later, when Jesus encounters blind Bartimaeus, he will ask him a very, very similar question. What is it you want me to do for you? There, Bartimaeus will ask something which is legitimate, which is allowed, because they ask him something which is really beyond his capacity. So very clearly, Mark has got no qualms with telling us that this is beyond the capacity of Jesus. The sitting is not the reclining, because late, you remember, at both the feeding miracles, the people reclined. They use the word sitting here, which indicates authority, which indicates domination. They want to dominate. They interpret authority as domination rather than as service. And Jesus responds that in order to be able to have that authority, which again is given, they must be able to go through what Jesus goes through. The cup is a metaphor for a variety of things. The cup can be a metaphor for joy. The cup can also be a metaphor for suffering. And here, the cup is a metaphor of the cross. Just like baptism, to be immersed. Baptizein means to be immersed. They respond with bravado that they can drink. And so Jesus is okay. You will drink the cup and you will be baptized. But very, very clearly, Jesus, like John, knows where his authority ends. His authority does not extend to granting places of honor. The 10 hear about this and they are angry with James and John. Notice, Jesus was angry with them when they prevented mothers from bringing their children to Jesus. Mark uses the same verb here. When the 10 are now angry with James and John, and by being angry with James and John, they show that they are in the same boat. Because the reason for their anger is, if James is on the right and John is on the left, then where are we going to be? That's why they are angry. Jesus, of course, because they are his disciples, will call them. The calling is an indication that some important teaching is now going to take place. And then the lesson is given about how the Gentiles have authority, how the Gentiles rule over, how the Gentiles lord it over, how the Gentiles behave with their subjects very clearly. They, of course, being disciples, will not behave in this manner. They will behave in a manner which is fitting of disciples of Jesus, which is basically to serve. And how will they serve? They will serve by looking at the example of their Lord, namely, who came to give his life as a ransom for all. Even though the term used here is ransom for many, it would seem to me that the many here must be interpreted in the sense of a few, in contrast to a few. It doesn't mean that Jesus will give his life as a ransom for many in the sense that many and not others, not most. No, the word many must be interpreted in this context as a ransom for many as opposed to a few, a small group of people. Even this many, I would interpret as those who want to be saved. And in a certain sense, while he will give himself as a ransom for all must leave the freedom of accepting that salvation to the individual. And that's why I would prefer to translate ransom for many, which means anyone and everyone who wants to be saved without distinction. This is what I would like to understand this particular teaching as. The third passion and resurrection prediction is the longest of the three and gives us what you might call even a summary of the passion narrative, both the trial before the Sanhedrin and the trial before Pilate. Like in the other two cases, there is a misunderstanding. Here, the misunderstanding is not on the surface level by James and John, yes, but also the other 10. And that is why Jesus teaches on discipleship, like he has done in the earlier two cases. Here, the teaching is the great must be servant, the one who wants to be great. The one who wants to be first must be slave. And the reinforcement is shown in the healing of blind Bartimaeus. In 8:22 to 26, we saw how a miracle of blindness and sight of a man who was given his sight back, but in two stages and with the use of external methods, begins the section of the way. And at the end of this miracle in chapter 10, verse 52, we will see how this miracle of the healing of blind Bartimaeus immediately, without the use of external methods, concludes the section of the way. Notice, Mark has got Jesus coming to Jericho and leaving Jericho immediately, and possibly to indicate that there is no need to remain in Jericho because Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. So the mention of Jericho is possibly because there was some historical background with this miracle in tradition. So Jericho is mentioned, but only as a place through which Jesus passes. Jericho is also mentioned in Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10, in the context of Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus. This crowd, along with the disciples, is following Jesus. It is likely that Bartimaeus was known in the first Christian community, but he is mentioned as a blind beggar, so he does not have external sight. He heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth. So if we look at the text, what we can see in the text is that we are told when he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth. So that means the people told him that it was Jesus of Nazareth who was passing through. He will not address Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth. However, he uses what is known as a messianic title, Jesus, son of David. If you go through the Gospel of Matthew, and especially Matthew's genealogy, you will realize the trouble that Matthew goes through to show that Jesus is of the lineage of David, even though Joseph is not the father of Jesus. He is the foster father. Joseph is the husband of Mary. And Matthew goes through great pains to show that Jesus is of the lineage of David, because the Messiah was expected to be a son of David. And even though many sternly ordered him, notice epitimao, once again used here. That means don't disturb this important rabbi. He's got other important things to do. You can't shout like this. You can't be unruly like this. But he responded by shouting even louder. So here, Jesus now responds. The standing still is an indication that Jesus has heard and is willing to stop his movement. The standing still is an indication that Jesus now will interrupt his move to the destination. Call him here. Now, those who said sternly to him, remain quiet, don't shout, don't talk loudly, are the ones who help him, because the rabbi has said so. Take heart, tarsei. There is courage. The same word which Jesus used to the disciples when he came walking on the water. Take heart, get up, he's calling you. Throwing off his crook. This can be interpreted in a variety of ways. We might remember that Simon and Andrew, James and John left their former life and they go behind Jesus. So throwing off his cloak, while on the surface level can be interpreted as his eagerness, can also be interpreted to mean that he believes he's going to get what he asks for. That means he will not need his cloak any longer, because many would think that the cloak was used as something wrapped around his body and kept in front of him to collect the alms or whatever else people would drop in. So it served as a bag, you might say. He would wrap it around his back and bring it in front and hold it like this in front of him, like this in front of him, so people would drop it and it would not fall out on the road, whether it was coins or even food. But the throwing of the cloak is an indication that Bartimaeus says to himself that he will not need his cloak, he will not be a beggar any longer, because he will be able to see. The question which Jesus asks here, what do you want me to do for you, is the same question that he asked earlier on James and John. In the case of Bartimaeus, Rabbi, that I might see, my teacher, let me see. That's all I want. Something which is Jesus' power to give. And notice, there is no touch. There is no spittle. There are no two stages. There is simply a word, go. Your faith has made you well. And the faith of Bartimaeus here must be interpreted as throwing off his cloak. I know that I will get what I ask for. And then he began to say, and notice the reason why I said this concludes the section of the way is because only in Mark, Matthew has the same miracle in chapter 20, a similar miracle, but in Matthew there are two blind men. Luke has the miracle, but Bartimaeus, Luke will not say followed him on the way. Only Mark alone of all the evangelists gives us this detail, namely, followed him on the way. So by this on the way, Mark ends the section of the way. And so we have got now the next chapter, that is the Jerusalem section, which contrasts with the Jerusalem section. In the Jerusalem section, there are 5 parts in a sort of concentric arrangement, and then later 2 more chapters. So the first chapter of our Jerusalem section is made up of these 5 parts, where Jesus enters the Jerusalem and the temple. At the end, he exits from the temple. There is controversy with regard to his authority. There is controversy with regard to a variety of subjects. And in between, the parable of the murderous tenants, which summarizes the opponents of Jesus. The entry of Jesus into Jerusalem begins in chapter 11, verse 12. Already sending his disciples to make arrangements for his entry into Jerusalem. So before he can enter Jerusalem, 2 disciples are sent. The 2 disciples are not named, and the reason why a colt is ordered, and a colt which has never been ridden before, is to indicate that for religious purpose, this is the colt that will be used. Also, Zechariah spoke about the king coming on a colt. The king is humble. He does not come on a horse. he comes on a colt, the young one of a horse. And so therefore, the king is the one who is to come. It seems very likely that when Jesus sent his disciples, he had already made prearrangements, or someone had made arrangement for him, because he tells them, this is what is going to happen when you go. When you see the colt and you are untying it, if anyone asks you, tell them this is what this is. And this possibly was the code word. The word kurios here could be either God, that means it is required for divine service. The Lord could refer to Jesus, but seemed very unlikely. Or it could refer possibly to the colt's owner, the one who owned the colt. The disciples go, and as in the past, Jesus is true to his instructions. The disciples find things exactly as they were told, and they bring the colt. What they do is they throw their cloaks on it, and the cloaks are thrown on it to make a makeshift saddle. And the people spread their cloaks on the road, so the colt would walk on the cloak as a sign of respect, and also leafy branches, stibadas. Mark uses leafy branches. John is the only evangelist who will talk about palm branches, not spread palm branches, but they were waving the palm branches, because John treats the entry as a victory already. So the entry of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is very clearly as a rabbi, yes, as a king, but as a king who will come not to show his authority and power, but as a king who will come to show his humility. There are two groups, one going ahead of Jesus, leading him, you might say, into Jerusalem. Another group following him also to show that Jesus is in the center. Jesus is the important. The word Hosanna is from the Aramaic Hoshiana, and originally Hoshiana meant save us now, save us please. Later, when the psalm was sung in much later years, it became as a shout of praise. You're singing the praise of God. And it became as a shout of praise for the one who comes to the kingdom, the one who comes to the temple. So any pilgrim was given that Hosanna. You're shouting praise to the one who comes. God is praised. The saving took later on the interpretation of as a hymn of praise. You're shouting God's praise. So at the time of Jesus, it could be interpreted both as saving, asking God to save, and praising God for God's graciousness. When Jesus enters, he looks around at everything. Possibly looking around at everything was to see what was going on. If later we are told that Jesus brought a whip to the temple, it is because he had seen the situation, he had seen how everything was. We come now to the fourth sandwich construction in the Gospel of Mark. It is only in the Gospel of Mark that the cursing of the fig tree is followed by the clearing of the temple, and then Mark once again mentions the withering of the fig tree. So in the center of the cursing and withering of the fig tree, Mark has got the clearing of the temple. And the reason why he has got the clearing of the temple in between and the cursing and withering on either side of the temple being clear is because Mark wants us, the readers, to identify and associate the fig tree with the temple. If Jesus can be so strong with the fig tree, which seems to have only the appearance of food, but no food? And if it is cursed, how much more will the temple, which seems to have only the appearance of worship and no true worship? On the following day, so that means the following day indicate he has gone, maybe reflected at night. When he saw the situation the previous evening, he was not very comfortable, possibly. So possibly spent the whole night reflecting on his action, reflecting on what he would do. The following day, now the next day, he was hungry. Now notice, it seemed very likely he could be hungry. Why? Because they were possibly in somebody's home in Bethany. So when they were in Bethany in somebody's home, it's likely also that they had breakfast. And that's when they came. So the reason for mentioning hunger is not so much to talk about the physical hunger, but the hunger which Jesus shows when he clears the temple. That is the hunger. So for example, in the Gospel of John, when Jesus hangs on the cross, the second last words of Jesus are, I thirst. The thirst there of Jesus is not to be interpreted as a physical thirst, because hardly does Jesus taste the vinegar that is put to his mouth. He hardly even drinks it. He only tastes it, because people misunderstand, thinking that he's thirsty. He thirsts, even on the cross, for God's will. The hunger here must be interpreted in the same manner. He saw the fig tree in leaf, and the fig tree leaf. Only Mark says it was not the season for figs. So by telling us this very clearly, Mark is inviting us to look beyond. He says, don't get caught up with the cursing of the fig tree. I'm telling you, it seems so irrational when it's not the season for figs, for Jesus to expect figs. No, because for the temple, Mark is saying, there is no in season and out of season. If a fig tree, when it's not the season for figs, could be cursed, imagine how much more a temple, when it should always be the season for worship. The repetition of the fact that there was nothing but leaves indicates once again that it looks like there is worship. It looks like there is celebration of God going on. But when you come close, nothing is there. And then it is cursed. And notice, we are told, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. Even though Jesus does not curse it as such, he says these words which have been interpreted as a curse. And because Peter will remember later, Mark adds this here, his disciples heard it. There are many, if not most, who, when they talk about this text, talk about the cleansing of the temple. I do not agree with that term at all. Jesus is not cleansing the temple. He is clearing the temple. And the reason why he clears the temple is in order to bring back the focus to what is meant to be done. Because very clearly, money changers were required, because a person who wanted to offer money in the temple could not offer Greek coins, could not offer Roman coins, had to offer Tyrian or Jewish coins alone. So the money changers were there to change the coins of people. When people came from other parts outside Jerusalem, they would come with either Greek coins or Roman coins, denarii. How would they offer? You could not offer a denarii. You could not offer anything which was not Tyrian or a Jewish coin. And so money changes were required. If you had to offer sacrifice, you did need people who sold doves and animals. So in a certain sense, There was a requirement. And if Jesus is clearing this, not even allowing people to carry anything through the temple. The temple cannot be used as a thoroughway, cannot be used as a passage. This is why I say it is clearing. So not only does Jesus take out the money changers, the dove sellers, the animal sellers, he will not even allow people to cross. Now, what is the problem with people carrying anything through? They're not selling, they're not buying. So we notice that's why he's not cleansing. He's trying to bring people back to the main reason why the temple exists. And what is the main reason? The main reason is that the temple is a house of prayer. Notice, Matthew will knock off all the nations, as Luke also will knock off, but Mark will keep it because Mark is inclusive. My house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. The mark in Jesus combines Isaiah and Jeremiah, but you have made it a den of robbers. And when the religious authorities hear this, they kept looking for a way to kill him, because this is how they envisioned the temple, because the sacrifices were to be offered. God was worshipped in this manner. So how are you saying that God can be worshipped in any other manner except through sacrifice, through penance, through fasting, through prayer, and so on? And then Jesus leaves the temple. So now he's not going to continue to labor the point. He has cleared the temple, and that is enough. He does not labor the point, just gives a message. Then Mark, who had interrupted the cursing of the fig tree. Notice in Matthew, the fig tree is cursed, if you like to use the word cursed, and withers instantly, because Matthew shows it as an act of power. Luke does not have this incident in his gospel. In the morning, they see that the fig tree has indeed withered, and withered to the roots. So the phrase expresses that Jesus' words have come true. And now, when you link up the fig tree with the temple, then you will realize what the point being made is. The fig tree that you cursed withered, Peter remembers that back. And Jesus very clearly speaks about prayer as the prime reason, worship as the prime reason for the existence of the temple. And because Peter interprets the fig tree, Jesus gives a lesson in prayer. And the lesson in prayer is basically to have faith before one can pray. And then he explains what faith means, that a person believes without any doubt. And the word doubt, the Greek word is dupsikos, which should be translated as double-minded. A person cannot say, I believe, and I do not believe. If you do not believe, your unbelief might be helped. But you cannot doubt and say, I want and I do not want. That is the meaning of a dupsikos, a double-minded person. Whatever you ask for in prayer, if you believe, and that's why I said, before Jesus goes to the house of Jairus, he believes and then he goes. Before Jesus dies, he believes he will be raised, and he was. And then there is an addition, which possibly became also part of the Christian tradition and the Christian community, about forgiveness. This is very strong in Matthew's community discourse. And here, what is also required is a forgiving attitude. So one removes from one's mind and heart any kind of block. Basically, lack of forgiveness is a block which will prevent God's grace from entering.